Senator Menendez is not only representative from New Jersey, but he is another source of pride to our Hispanic community. He has been an staunch defender of freedom and democracy in Latin America. For all the Venezuelans that are here, he spearheaded in 2014 the Venezuelan Democracy and Human Rights Act, which was the first response from the U.S. Congress to the repression of students, blatant repression of students by the Venezuelan regime. He's also he has supported civic action throughout Latin America to fight dictatorships all over the region, for which we are very grateful. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, and let me excuse myself. We have a very busy day on the Senate. We are debating on the floor of the Senate, how do we save young people who are dreamers, and we want their dreams to be realized. And so that's a very important issue. And at the same time, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, of which I am the senior Democrat, was holding a hearing on nominations. So I regret that I couldn't get here earlier, but I'm glad to still be able to make it with you. So you'll excuse me. Perdona, bienvenido a Washington. Y estamos en un día muy arduoso en el Senado con el problema de cómo resolvemos a estos muchachos la oportunidad de realizar su sueño de quedarse aquí legítimamente en los Estados Unidos, y a la misma vez tenemos vistas del Comité de Relación Internacional del Senado, de lo cual soy el demócrata de rango, así que estamos tratando de hacer como un circo, muchas cosas a la misma vez, ¿no? Así que, pero es un placer estar aquí. Let me thank the Interamerican Institute for Democracy for bringing us together. I think everyone in this room fully understands that the challenges confronting the United States and our values in the Western Hemisphere have real, immediate, and lasting implications for U.S. national security. From the ongoing turmoil in Venezuela, continued oppression in Cuba, to the growing presence of foreign adversaries like Russia and economic competitors like China, to the threats posed by transnational gangs, what happens in Central and Latin America and the Caribbean is of enormous consequence to the United States of America. And amid these challenges, we look across the hemisphere, we still see nations that share our values and our commitment to democracy and human rights. We see governments continuing to increase security and strengthen the rule of law. We see growing middle classes building prosperous, innovative economies. We see citizens investing in education and holding their governments accountable. So there is encouraging progress among our allies and rising global partners. And in almost all of these cases, the United States benefits from that close partnership based on shared principles. Partnerships that have been strengthened by successive U.S. administrations, by Republicans and Democrats alike. We need that partnership as a continued commitment and engagement if we hope to build a hemisphere on stability, prosperity, and security. So I have, in that respect, real concerns about the budget that the administration has presented. You cannot cut the State Department and U.S.A. by over 30% and be able to promote our democratic and principles throughout the hemisphere and our development assistance, which I think is incredibly important. And at a time when regimes in Cuba and Venezuela are destroying their own countries and ruining the lives of their people, at a time when rivals like China and Russia are increasing their engagement in Latin America, at a time when the region is threatened by non-state actors trying to sow chaos and fear and undermine regional stability, it's precisely the time for America to lead with our values, growing, not slashing, the programs that promote peace, stability, and democracy around the world. Now, when I see the challenges that threaten the United States' interests and our allies in the hemisphere, we need not look more than 90 miles off the southern coast of Florida. The Castro regime continues its cruel grip on power and oppression of the Cuban people, clinging to an ideology that it has spent decades propagating throughout the entire region, an ideology that at its core deprives people of their fundamental human rights, oppresses basic freedoms, and leaves Cubans in economic desperation. In recent years, some ill-conceived changes in U.S. policy, and I believe misguided agreements with the European Union, the government of Cuba has not changed course. In just the last year alone, the Cuban regime has either perpetrated or permitted a series of attacks against U.S. diplomats. It has hosted a visit by the Russian spy ship Viktor Lenov, and it has signed a defense technology agreement with the Russian government, all at a time when we are increasingly aware of Russian intelligence threats against the United States and the Kremlin's ongoing effort to destabilize societies globally. And the Cuban regime continues to provide safe harbor to a long list of U.S. fugitives, including Joanne Chesimard, who is on the FBI most wanted list for killing a state trooper from my home state of New Jersey. So when it comes to the Castro regime's geopolitical strategy, we should have zero doubts about its intentions. Beyond the abuse within its own borders, for more than a half-century, Cuba effectively exported its philosophy, its oppression throughout the Americas, and we still see lingering remnants. In Nicaragua, Daniel Ortega, a longtime friend of the Castros, claimed victory in 2016 in an election that no international observer could credibly call fair and free. For a decade, Mr. Ortega has expanded his control over the country's institutions, taken steps to disqualify the country's political opposition, and he is working with his wife to install a dynastic regime. 2 months ago in Bolivia, Evo Morales used his political control of the country's courts to remove presidential term limits, despite the fact that Bolivia's citizens voted in a 2016 referendum to keep term limits in place. But of course, the most devastating legacy of the Castro regime is the political, economic, and humanitarian crisis in Venezuela. Last year, in testimony before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the OAS Secretary General Luis Almagro described the Cuban presence in Venezuela as that, his words, of an occupation army, a stunning characterization that none of us should forget. The tragedy in Venezuela has grown to a dimension that many would have considered unthinkable. Tragically, Venezuela today is a failed state, one governed by an authoritarian president who permits officials in his government and the military to plunder state coffers, facilitate drug trafficking, and use food shipments as a tool of political coercion against their fellow citizens. And this tragedy brings new risks for regional stability. As refugees cross borders by the tens of thousands to Colombia and Venezuela, in Brazil, they also seek refuge here in the United States. For 2 years in a row, the United States has received more asylum requests from Venezuelans than any other nation in the world. Let me say that again. Even with all the crises taking place around the globe, in Syria, in countries throughout Africa, more Venezuelans have asked for asylum than citizens than any other country in the world. And as the Washington Post reported this week, the food shortages in Venezuela are so severe that mothers are giving up children they love to orphanages in the hope that they won't starve to death. Clearly, what's happening in Venezuela today is only the tip of an iceberg in a crisis of global proportions. We have a responsibility to do everything possible to help the Venezuelan people. And that is why I will continue to press the President, the State Department, the Departments of Justice and Treasury to hold Venezuelan officials to account for their role in human rights abuses, corruption, and drug trafficking. And as part of that, if you go to Venezuela and you go to the airport, you'll probably the security process will be with Cuban agents at the airport. Cuban intelligence is helping the Maduro regime repress its own people. And so its tentacles and its engagement, hosting the FARC in Colombia in terms of the peace talks, may have been seen as a good thing, but at the end of the day, if the FARC moves to be a political organization within Colombia, it'll be the regime that will have tentacles into the FARC's political movement in a country that otherwise is incredibly stable. And so the nefarious activities of the regime spread far beyond the abuses of its own people. And lastly, I have real concerns of threats from outside of the hemisphere. I think we must remain focused on challenges for governments like Russia. Since the 2016 U.S. election, the American people are continuing to learn the depths of the threats Russia's intelligence services pose both here at home and around the world. And so, as Mexico is in the midst of its elections, we see Russian influence in the attempts to influence that election. And all of us should be outraged, from the most common citizen to the President of the United States, about Russia seeking to interfere in our elections. Whether or not they succeeded in interfering is not the question. The mere attempt to have a cybersecurity effort against a country, a sovereign country, the United States, Mexico, France, and other countries in Europe, should be alarming to us as citizens of democratic nations. And so we need to make sure that we push back on the external threats in our hemisphere, as well as those that are generated by countries like Cuba. So I appreciate your focus. You know, I'll close on this, one of my concerns as a 26-year member of Congress between here, the House of Representatives, where I started, and for the last 13 years in the United States Senate, is that we do not have enough members of Congress who are focused on Latin America and the Caribbean. And yet it is our own neighbors, it is our own security interests, it is in our collective economic interests, it is in the healthcare security of our hemisphere. Diseases know no boundaries. At the end of the day, human aspirations know no boundaries, and democracy should know no boundaries whatsoever as well. And so I am at the forefront of trying to get more of my colleagues to be engaged in Latin America and the Caribbean as a focal point of their attention. Because if we achieve that, we can have a much more prosperous, much more democratic, much more observant of human rights in the hemisphere. And I look forward to continuing to play a role in that regard, and I look forward to your organization playing a role in that regard as well. Muchísimas gracias.
Well, with these words of the closing remarks of Senator Menendez, we adjourn this forum. Thank you so much for your attendance.